Okay, my next question is this. Um, is it any way that the viewers can help or support, or, what can they do in terms of, the struggle for the indigenous people in Australia?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key things at the moment, and definitely being educated is, it doesn't cost a thing to be educated, although it costs your time, and it does cost considerable time to try and be educated in a proper way and to really understand the truth of what is underneath all of these colonial lies and illusions that are being painted about like a place like Australia that has, one thing that I see about this country is it's done well to put propaganda out to the rest of the world about what it is, and there's things such as the lucky country and the fair country, meaning fair opportunity, reasonable opportunity for every human being, which definitely that doesn't apply to you if you're indigenous, or if you're or black from other bloodlines, or other people who are not white. So white Australia policy is something that was really strong going back through the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, where there was real aggressive approaches to trying to eliminate any kind of immigration to this country that wasn't from more or less Great Britain or other parts of Europe. And there was a lot of media in regards to that and propaganda that was put out there, and it was severe. And that went on for quite a considerable period of time. And that went on from one thing to the next to 1967, which was when Indigenous people first got acknowledged as human beings in this country and were able to vote in the elections for Parliament and all of that over here. So my mother, in saying that, she was born as not being considered human, and so was every other Aboriginal person that was born before 1962. So a big thing definitely is understanding the legacy of colonial impacts in this country is absolutely crucial to. And that thing I mentioned earlier about terra nullius, which they built this whole country based off of an absolute slander to indigenous people, to say this was no man's land because you weren't, as a people, properly inhabiting it. So it was a declaration that our society was not civilized, that somehow we were just living here. But like sometimes I have to laugh because I'll cry otherwise. But like to look that we here for 80,000 plus years, but they decided in their mind that the way we were using the land wasn't appropriate because it wasn't extracting. That was the mentality behind the terra nullius that got rolled out over here. So for me, it's important for allies or people in solidarity with our cause to really understand how that was a really, in terms of looking at our humanity, it didn't look at our humanity. So it's important for people to understand that the starting point of Australia was human injustices, and that for Australia to be upheld under its current construct that doesn't acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty is an inhumane construct, and it's not acceptable. So for people to have a baseline understanding around that, I feel is really important in this world right now, and to be able to converse with people and challenge the ideas around Australia being the fair country or the lucky country and so on and so forth, when you have, as I stated earlier, so many of them disparities in regards to the Indigenous experience. Above and beyond that, there's obviously a big movement going on at the moment with Indigenous people, and probably the biggest in my known life, and maybe the biggest since when our people were first fighting for those transformational changes that led to a lot of our first land rights based movement activity that got large scale momentum across the whole country, which in its, I suppose, most I guess, powerful sense of starting to take action that was in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It does go back much more further in history, but it was around that time when it began to get a lot of steam in regards to it. And there were land rights claims in the 1990s that proved that terra nullius was, in fact, a fraudulent claim to being able to obtain land. So we're at this really beautiful point in time where it's not only Indigenous people understanding our connection to this land and what that means to the now, but it's a lot of other people too, as much as, at least within my lifetime, that are getting behind that. And when I talk to a lot of the elders as well, it's the same for them. This is one of the biggest turning points, if not the biggest turning point in the history for this land and what the future might be. And when you think of the issues like climate change and things like that that are decimating the whole planet, we are to consider the truth of that, then we are at a tipping point. And a lot of people, particularly with these big fires that we had out here, was like 2 years ago, the start of 2020, the whole East Coast from the bottom of so-called Queensland all the way down to further south of where I am, which was about, these fires went from about 2,000 kilometers, more than 2,000 kilometers, so over 1,000 miles, 1,500 miles or so. These fires, they made their way down, and we'd never seen anything like that. It was the biggest fires that we've ever had here in this country. And for that moment, people started to think, you know what, maybe we should listen to Indigenous people. Maybe if we want to survive, we need to look at Indigenous land management practices. And there were some really powerful things that came out of that, where Indigenous people had just been using cultural burning practices of the landscape around some houses that were in the middle of those fires. And some of those burns had only been going on for, say, 1 or 2 years around these houses. And where some of that happened, this whole big fire that came through, it didn't affect some of those houses and communities that already had that Indigenous land management practice just for a couple of years there. So people being educated about Indigenous land management practices and what that value will mean for the future, and what Indigenous justice means for that to the future, and to lobby with us, that alone is a really powerful tool moving into the future. And of course, there's going to be a lot of high level conversations to be had in terms of the legalities of how you put together a democratic society. And no doubt I expect to see many changes that will come. So if people believe in that vision and they have expertise that can sit up there to be involved in some of those conversations, then definitely there's a lot of support that can be done with that. But, you know, where we're at too is thinking globally as well. And we're here for humanity as a whole. We're in solidarity with all other Indigenous people, all other oppressed people. And that's always been a thing for us, is we're very welcoming people. We're very loving people. And we hate to see people stood on by anybody else. It's not in our way of living to see anybody stood on and destroyed. So, we're in solidarity with that movement. So if people have got movements that they feel are similar, that they feel having us connected into it to understand what that is, then that's a way that we can feel help, because we're being useful to a bigger cause that's ultimately for humanity, and that stands against oppression of all people, and of course other black peoples of around the world. We relate to the oppression and the extreme oppression that still continues across the world. That, again, like, it is devastating that this is still what's going on over here. Indigenous people are still getting shot by police on a regular basis. I think somebody passed away today, and it's out of hand. And we don't stand for that anywhere in the world, and we want to unite with everybody that's against those things.